All right.
All right, good.
To say, if you are at this point, I'm gonna keep moving things along. This blue button here that says new project is what we're looking for today. And at least for these first couple of classes, I'm going to be doing stuff in 2D. If you see something that says like basic 2D built in or something, that's also okay, but probably universal 2D is the first thing you're going to see. So I'm going to click on that. And I find that naming things well is a critical part of technical development. You want names that tell you what stuff is. So I'm not going to leave this being called my project. In my particular case, I'm going to change the name to UFO Basic. Oh, I'm going to say I was trying. Okay. Or UFO Starter, because apparently I was not yet able to delete the old one. Doesn't particularly matter whether it matches or not. And then I'm going to have to wait for progress bars for a couple of minutes while it builds the project. And odds are, so are you. Here's my read. I'm going to delete it now. So now for those of you who haven't necessarily been as deep into this or done as much, Unity's a game engine and editing tool. Most of the times when we talk about game engines now, we are also referring to the tools we use to organize and build assets and not just to the blocks of code that we use to facilitate development. That is part of what an engine provides. It provides code solutions to common challenges in game development, certain tasks that you expect to have to do, like displaying models and sprites and animations, playing sounds, communicating over a network, processing user input, and responding to events taking place in game. Also, physics simulation is a very, very common task that a lot of different games make use of. So let's see, can I now delete that? I'll try anyway. Okay, so I am waiting on this still to boot up. Unity is the one we use mostly at Clark. Some projects do end up being done in other tools, but this is kind of our standard baseline. A number of greenlit projects, student-run projects also get done in Unreal. Those are kind of our main tools at the moment. Unity was kind of, for a little while had Unreal licensing still wasn't very beginner friendly, so Unity kind of stole a march on them for a while. As Unreal lowered the bar to development for small studios, they surged in popularity largely because they had default access to some better rendering tools, but Unity has mostly caught up in that regard. We're going to be doing a little bit of scene layout and very small amount of coding. Unity's coding is primarily done in a language called C#, which Microsoft developed. As I say, Microsoft developed mostly because they looked at Java and they said, we love everything about this except the fact that it's owned by Oracle. Owned by someone who's not us, really. The two languages aren't identical, but they do look an awful lot like each other, and more like each other than either one looks like C++, which is the language Unreal uses that's widely used throughout the industry, although all three of them have certain common structures. So a little bit I might compare C# and Java to being like Italian and Portuguese, but then C++ is French at that point. There's certain common things, little bits of grammar that you'll find in all the languages that you'll recognize if you know any one of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just sit down and like, oh, that's what this does. All right, we're starting to move along here. All right. Progress bars are filling up. So once that happens, it will fill in. Okay, for those of you who might not have used this before, Unity has sort of 4 major areas to the screen. They can be rearranged, but they're usually laid out like this by default. Your project is your collection of all the assets, whatever they do, that are available for you to use in your games. I compare it sort of like it's the bin full of Legos that you have to work from. Any individual level that you're working on is more like the specific project that you want to build. It's displayed in two different ways. It's displayed in the hierarchy, which is a list basically of what are the pieces that you're using in your level or your scene. And then there's the scene window, which is a visual access to that thing. And then whatever you have selected in your editor, you get extra information about over here in the inspector. And in this particular case, there is not much here. There's a couple, most of the elements that are here are just sort of stock bits of support machinery. In order to be able to run this, I'm going to go get that file that was downloaded here. It's probably in your downloads directory, which is ufo.unity package. And I'm going to drag it in here. Up until about 2017 or so, Unity shipped with sort of a common standard pack of assets that was like automatically installed in every new project. They stopped doing that a while ago, so we get to come up with our basic assets from somewhere else. And it'll pop up a little window kind of like this one that says import Unity package. And there's like 6 things here in different folders. I'm going to take all of them for convenience's sake and say import. And there'll be a little ka-chunk here for a moment while it processes everything. That's a technical term.
Never heard that one before. I am new to the industry.
I'm saying this whole thing brings in this new folder that was part of the package called Gameplay. And it has a few subfolders in it. Goals and levels and player. I'm going to ignore goals just for the moment. In order to, if I want to be able to like move stuff around or interact with things, I like to be able to see them reasonably clearly. So I will usually put in at least something basic in 3D. I'll usually start by just putting down like a flat plane to interact with. But in this particular case, I have this basic sort of grid image that came with the project. I'm just going to drag it out into the hierarchy window. You could drag it into the scene window, but then you have to decide like where to put it. And it creates this copy of it. I can see that in the scene view, it's got that red border because it's selected. Anything that's selected in the hierarchy is also selected in the scene view and vice versa. If I want to see what this would look like in Engine, I can click here on Game. And right now I'm going to say, in the words of the intro to Aladdin, too close, a little too close. This particular case, the solution is to take our camera in the scene view. If I scroll out, you can see sort of the widget for the camera, and a little bit, you may very faintly be able to see the box that defines its border. It doesn't show up very well on a gray background, but there's the edge of it, for example. It's overlapping the screen. But when I click on the camera, I get all this info over here in the inspector about its different components. Some of them I'm going to ignore, like the audio listener. But right now what I'm interested in is the camera's size. This is how large of an area it's able to look at once. And since it's zoomed in too close, I want the size to be larger. For instance, if I were to go to 10, so that's double the size, and I go over to here, I can see that I can now see much more of the area. I can't quite see all of it. So a little bit, I'm going to fine tune this, and I'm going to change it to 16, and that's just about perfect. You know, gets this pretty tidily fit within our visible area. Now I have sort of a yardstick that I can measure movement and placement against visually when I'm in the scene. And I want something that I can control, something that represents player action in my simulation, which usually we refer to as an avatar. And so in my player folder, I have this other sprite called UFO here, and I'm just going to drag it out into the scene. And in this case, we don't necessarily see it show up right away in the game view. If I click over to scene view, I can see that it's here. However, although I'm seeing the outline, I'm not seeing the thing. When 2D images like this are placed more or less overlapping each other, sometimes Unity can have a hard time deciding which one to draw first. There's a couple ways to change this. One is you can actually just change the distance from the camera to certain things. So I could change this thing V to -1, at which point they're not like right on top of each other anymore. Or sprites, you can also look for this sorting layer element, and the order in layer says how to resolve these conflicts. Things with smaller numbers will always be drawn behind things with bigger numbers. So I could change this to -1 too. Oh, that's wrong. That's the UFO. So I could change the UFO to 1, or I could change the background to -1, and it would start sorting them correctly. Now I'm going to want to deal with user input and control in just a minute, but one of the sort of the easiest ways to save space and to get certain parts of your simulation for very little effort is that Unity does include tools for physics simulation. Specifically, it includes 2 sets of tools for physics simulation, one for 3D and one for 2D. It sort of assumes that 3D is the default. The component that manages physics simulation for 3D is called a rigid body. The one that manages it for 2D is called a rigid body 2D. So 3D is what we call the unmarked default. And if I were to, in this case, there's a couple ways to add a new element to an existing object, what we call a component. One is you can go to the component menu and go looking for what you want, like this physics 2D menu. The other way is that you can click the add component button here in the inspector, which will tend to pull you up at a very similar list. You can drill down through this, or you can search it with this little box here. So if I type 2D, it cuts me down to things that have 2D in the name. I'm going to scroll down a bit. I'm going to find rigid body 2D. This is our basic unit of physics simulation. It represents something that has mass and is subject to physical forces, something that can have momentum, something that is included in the simulation. And if I go and I test this out by pressing this play button up here, once, we got another little pause for rebuilding here. And I watch this, I can see that this just sort of falls out of frame and is currently on its way to the bottom of the universe. Not quite what I'm looking for. In a lot of platform games, that might be desirable, although I'd want some kind of ground or something that things could land on. There's a couple ways to monkey with the way gravity behaves. If you have some things that shouldn't fall and some things that should in a simulation, like in a Mario game, Mario should fall from gravity at least most of the time, but one of the bullet enemies just travels in a straight line unless it hits something. You can control that behavior selectively on some objects by changing their gravity scale in 2D. But in this case, what I have is a top-down style game. I don't actually want gravity affecting anything here. So instead, I'm going to go to the settings for the project. I'm going to go to Edit. I'm going to go to Project Settings down near the bottom of the Edit menu. I'm going to find this section over here. It's already highlighted in my case, called Physics 2D. It gives us a whole bunch of knobs for fine-tuning the physics simulation, most of which we don't need most of the time. But we're interested in these 2 at the top where it says gravity X and Y. Pretty much by definition, normal simulations, the X gravity is 0 because the whole point of gravity is it goes. In fact, down is generally defined as whichever way gravity goes. On the other hand, you might, if when you're in some situation, or if you're playing one of those games that lets you like tilt the world under the player or something like that, you might potentially reset gravity to point in a different direction. Y is set to the usual number for gravity in metric, 9.81 meters per second per second. The negative means towards the bottom of the screen. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to change it to 0. Once I click on this again, in this case, it's not super exciting. It doesn't really do anything. Because the only thing that would act on it right now is gravity, and we just expressly turned that off. But this gives us a basis for making it move without having to fuss with a lot of other stuff. So my other step here at the moment is that when we want custom behavior, which includes basically anything that isn't automatic physics, Unity has tools for writing our own script files using C# code, which creates new components that can be added onto objects like this. I have one here. We'll write another one at the end, toward the end of class. It's not actually very long. It just handles motion. And I'm going to take it, and there's a couple things I can do. One is I can just drag this onto the UFO object. But if you see like where that blue line is appearing, it's very easy to mess up and drag out a brand new object that doesn't do anything. So a lot of times, alternatively, what I'll do is I'll select this and I'll either drag player input over until I do find a blue line in between the other components, and I can drop it, or I can go back to add component and type something like input and see player input script appears. It's not going to do much right away if I play this, because one, although I have said that it is possible for this object to receive input, I haven't specified what any of that input is. We'll do that in a second. And two, the speed that it's going to apply is set to 0 right now. That's the easier one to fix. I'm going to do that first. I really should have a default. And I'm going to change that 0 to 100. Technically, it's not speed, it's force, but most of us aren't concerned about those niceties. My motion input here gives me, it should actually be set to vector 2, but it works fine even if you don't fix that part. It says, hey, I would like to be able to receive two-dimensional input, but it doesn't have any way of saying where should I get that input from, but it does give us a way to add that. If I go over to this little plus sign on my motion input and I click it, it gives me some choices. And in our particular case, there's a bunch of ways to put in two-dimensional input. You might have a joystick, you might have a thumbstick or a D-pad. On some setups, you might be able to control where the mouse is on the screen. Or in our case, what we have ready access to is a keyboard. Unity will also let you put more than one of these on the same thing so that the game that works using the keyboard will also more or less flawlessly go onto a system with a joystick. I'm going to say I want to add an up, down, left, right composite. And what that means is that in order to get my 4 directions, I need 4 different keys that are all going to feed into the same thing. And you see how under motion input now it is specified this thing that has up, down, left, and right. They also all say no binding, which means that even though we have an option to put things there, we haven't yet. For keyboard, it's a pretty typical way to be able to specify up, down, left, and right. There's a couple. Is that a thought back there? I mean, I can say, but I figure one of y'all knows. Probably the default for most of these environments has been around at least since the days I was playing Apple II games in my 4th grade classroom. So in this case, yeah, WASD. If I click on my up, this little sub window appears. I don't really like the black on black theme. It's often hard to see when a window's on top of another window. But if I want to specify what the binding is, I can say path. And there's a couple ways to do this. Typically, like for instance, I could specify a joystick input. I can also, in this case, specify the keyboard. I don't care so much what letter they're typing on the keys. I figure that they want the keys to be placed ergonomically together in a certain part of the keyboard. So I'm going to go with location by key rather than by character mapped to key. And then you just get this list of various keys. I could also pick the up arrows and I can scroll down to W. And then when I click out here, I see that now up is bound to W on the keyboard. You can also, in some cases, go faster. If I want down, it will go a little bit faster anyway because path will now default to keyboard. But the other thing you can do is you can click this listen button and then hit the thing you want to be the command. So for instance, if I press the S key, it now says that S is something it just detected. And I can click on that, and now S has been bound to down. And left, I'm going to bind to A. And right, I'm going to bind to D. And at this point, I have more or less what I expect to see. WSAD. I could rearrange them, although it doesn't really do anything. It just makes it perhaps read a little bit more like we expect it to. It's not especially useful. Just rearranged on the screen. In this case, now finally, when I go here, and wait for it to adjust all of the changes I made. Now, as I hold WASD, it will start moving this thing around. One might want it to move a little bit faster, depending. I've used sort of space style controls here. If you stop accelerating, you still keep moving until you slow down and try to go the other way. My background is currently entirely visual. I'm not actually doing anything that confines my motion. We'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. I don't want to get bogged down in it right now. If I want to, say, speed up, I could try changing the speed to a larger number. And see right away that it moves quite a bit faster now. However, you want to be a little careful. It can be very valuable to edit numbers while you're in player mode like this because you can immediately see the effects. But you do need to be aware that the moment you stop player mode, any edits you make get forgotten. Like my motion input has reverted. Oh, actually, that part hasn't changed because I changed the underlying asset. But the speed here has changed back to 100. So anything, it can be useful to discover the value you want while you're editing in player mode, but you always have to be prepared to type it back in. So like 400 maybe. Sometimes, much to my chagrin, pretty much everybody working on a Unity project will discover a point where they will realize that they have been paused in play mode for the last 45 minutes of work, and it's all going to evaporate as soon as they go back to play mode, out of play mode. The best solution I've found for this is to select the object while you're paused, copy it, stop play mode, and paste it back in. Other than that, don't have a good solution for that one. All right, so we have an environment, we have something that represents the player, we have the player's ability to give input to it. But ideally, we would also like something we can interact with. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to work on that. And we will write a script eventually to handle that interaction. Under goals, I have.
All of this will be recorded if you and posted later, by the way.
Yes, I will have at least one version of this class available to view probably this afternoon. So I can just go ahead, for instance, and I can drag it into the scene view. Some people like to do that because they can decide where to drop it. I usually prefer to drag them into the hierarchy because then I know basically where they're going to go. In this case, it went on top of this other thing. If I want to move it around, I can click the move tool or I can use the W key to do the same thing. And you can pull on the arrows or you can grab the little blue thing and drag it where you want it to go. But by default, like this, I can just breeze right over. All it is right now is a picture of a rock. It has no other purpose or existence at the moment, so there's absolutely no response to what that does. if I want to interact with this, one of the first things I have to do is I have to establish volume. The rigid body tool that's on the UFO defines mass and velocity and momentum, but it doesn't define volume. You can have an object that has mass but no volume. Computer simulations will frequently allow you to do things that don't exist in real life. Sometimes that's a bug to be dealt with. Sometimes it's fun. But in this particular case, if I want to be able to detect things touching, I need to define their volume, or in 2 dimensions, their area and their shape. And so in this case, I've got my UFO. I'm going to add a new component. I'm going to whittle it down to collider. And I'm going to look in this case for circle collider 2D. Don't put like a box collider or a capsule collider on it that's not 2D, because it will not interact with 2D objects. The 3D physics engine and the 2D physics engine are actually completely separate from each other. And I have not yet run into a situation in the game where it's advantageous to have 2-dimensional physics and 3-dimensional physics running in the same scene. I'm going to pick a circle collider because my player shape is basically circular. And one of the things I have noticed over the years is that very little enrages players like inconsistent hitboxes. You want to make somebody throw a controller, set things up so that they died even though they could totally see that the bullet absolutely missed them. Or that the opponent didn't die even though they clearly hit them. So I've got my circle collider. I can't see it very easily. When you have things that are selected that have colliders, Unity will draw a little green line around the collider area. You can kind of just see it right now. It's pretty much in sync with the orange circle, but it is very thin. If I want to adjust it to fit better, I can either type a smaller radius, or I can just put my mouse right here next to it. See, I get the little arrows on either end of my pointer tip and drag sideways until I see the radius land about where I want it to, more or less overlapping the boundaries of the shape. 2.15, or I could say that 2.1 is pretty good too. A lot of times I will drag and then I will make it a slightly rounder, nicer number if that's reasonable. And if I want it to be able to bonk into the pickup doesn't necessarily need a rigid body, but it does need a collider. If we want to be able to like bounce it around, it'll need a rigid body. But if we just want to be able to detect that we're touching it, it just needs a collider. I'm going to look at this. I can see the boundary for my collider, but it's way outside the regular shape. I'm going to drag my radius down so that it pretty closely hugs the shape of the pickup. Now, once it's running and I start moving, I can crash into this thing and nothing much happens. So I can start rolling. If I don't want to roll, there's a way to deal with that. It is now, yes. Now it is not just a picture of a rock, it is an actual rock. If I want, for instance, if I want the UFO to stay without rolling over, one of the things I can do is I can go to the UFO, I can find the settings for the rigid body, I can go down towards the bottom of this block where it says constraints and open it up. And I can say freeze the Z rotation. Do not allow this thing to rotate as a result of physics collisions. That part's optional because a circle shape, it doesn't really matter how it rolls most of the time, but it can be disorienting to have that thing rolling over and over. If I want to be able to do something like with this, like collect it, then I have to tell Unity that. It doesn't know any defaults or obvious basics or anything like that. So we have to specify what we want to happen in this case. So I need to add a new script asset to my project. The create asset menu is available in about 3 different places. You can go to the assets menu at the top of the Unity window, and create is right at the top. And you see this other submenu. You can right click out in your project window and see the assets menu just like it was up there. So create is still up here. Or you can go to this little plus button in the project window and you click on that, you just automatically get the create submenu without the upper layer. You can find making a new script fittingly under the scripting submenu, but because it is also a very, very commonly used asset, it's normally just right here at the top in the convenient choices, what we call a mono behavior script. Behavior is Unity's general term for anything that can respond to messages, basically. And mono, in this case, is the name of the environment that does stuff in C#, the open source equivalent to .NET. It will invite you to rename the file. The file will be in edit name mode when you first create it. This used to be important to pick a name at this point. It's still convenient, but it's now much friendlier to renaming it later. I'm going to change this to collectible. The semicolon is silent. Collectible. There we go. By itself, though, this says that I'm creating a new kind of component. It does not say anything about what that component does. And I double click on this. It will boot up Visual Studio. If it wants you to sign in, you can tell it not now. I have found that loading the project does not always cause your code file to appear right away. So you can either go digging through the files, or you can just go back to Unity, double click the collectible file again to get it opened up in edit mode. Making a new behavior script, Unity fills a few things in to try and be helpful for you. The main one is the class. The class is the thing that defines what the component element is. It has that same thing that I changed the file name to, collectible. And Unity figures, hey, you might want these different things, what to do when the object is created, and what to do every frame while the object exists in the scene. But in this particular case, I actually don't want either of those. I'm just going to go ahead and delete those. Make sure that you don't have like any stray curly braces left behind, or that you didn't like accidentally cut out the closed brace on the end or something like that. And then I'm going to put in here a message, which is a function, is an operation that Unity knows about, knows how it's supposed to work, and can make happen under specific circumstances. For that to happen, we have to choose a name that Unity recognizes. So in this case, void isn't, tends to tell it this is a function that doesn't make a new value. It's just a thing that happens. And then I give it the name on collision enter. And you'll notice it will offer to fill things in for you. And in this case, I need on collision enter 2D because that's what's going to detect collisions between 2D objects. I could potentially do things like ask, hey, did I collide with something that can keep a score? I could give it score or something like that. I don't have anything too elaborate at the moment, and we're fairly low on time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say something very simple. I'm going to write destroy game object. In this case, game object with a lowercase g means whatever object this component is a part of. If I were just to write something like destroy this, would only destroy the component. The script itself would go away off of the object, but the object would still be there. That's not what I want in this case. Occasionally, I have found situations where that's useful, but this is not one of them. So I want to destroy the whole thing so that the sprite also goes away. Or destroy has the additional feature that if I do like this, it will destroy it almost immediately. Not quite instantaneously, it'll destroy it at the end of the frame before going into the next frame of your game running. If I want to set some time, it is a very, very common situation that when something encounters something, you want it to start the process of going away, but not necessarily finish. So Destroy has the additional feature that you can specify a time in seconds. If you just want to specify a whole second, it's fine. If you want there to be a fraction or a decimal point on there, for computer language reasons, you have to put an F. It's because Unity expects a single precision floating point value, a float type number. And if you don't have anything else on there, it assumes that you want a double precision number. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it too much. It is enough to say that if it doesn't like your number with fractions, try putting an F on it. And now, one thing I ran into with the other class, when you're editing code changes, make sure you save. Unity will not recreate or re-understand your script or apply any of the changes you make to your code until you save those changes. I have seen people beat their head against something for 15 minutes trying to figure out why nothing is changing their problem, and then realize it's because they didn't save the file. And occasionally, that person's been me.
I haven't used the all that much, but in the other languages and engines I have used, like, yeah, it's it can be rough.
Oh yeah, no, I had another case where I literally tried to figure out what an issue is for over 2 hours with no changes or progress before I realized that the copy of the file I was editing was not the copy that was in the project and being used. 2.5 hours of my life I'll never get back. All right, now creating this script, however, doesn't do anything by itself. It just says that the script is possible. It puts another Lego in the bin, but if we want that to affect what's happening in our scene, we have to click that brick onto something for it to actually matter. And I can attach it much like the player input, either by dragging onto it. I don't really like that solution going into the scene window. For instance, if I take this collectible script and like I miss and I get that blue line, it makes a new object that just has the collectible script on it and nothing else, which is pretty useless. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to highlight my pickup. I'm going to drag this in here, make sure that I'm getting one of the lines, make sure that you see it appear on the script. And now, when I play this, and I move around, I hit it, I stop, but a second later, or more accurately, a second and a half, poof, it disappears, including my ability to now go right through that area. I only have a couple of minutes left. I'm not going to talk about how to add new features or things like that. Tomorrow we will come back with a slightly different game, but one that has, more features for us to engage with, especially because we won't have to start from absolute scratch getting Unity set up and everything. The last thing I'm going to do in this case is just demonstrate very briefly the power of Unity's input system. I did talk about it. If we look at the motion input, which is our 2D vector, and I have these bindings, I can, for instance, select all of these guys. Can I select? Yes, multi-select them. Say Control D, and now I have 8 bindings. It doesn't really matter to have the W key bound twice, but it very easily gives me a way to fix the paths by saying, for instance, listen, up arrow, left. I can also just find the left arrow, just double check, up arrow, S was down arrow, and D is right arrow. And so now in this case, I have set up where I can control this with either of these setups at the same time, if I want to. So if I play this, and I could, for instance, also add bindings for a gamepad, thumbstick, or pretty much anything else that can provide 2D input. So now I can, if I want to, speed it up with WASD and then slow it down with the arrow keys. And they both interoperate just fine. I think second and a half is actually a surprisingly long time when your brain is in game mode most of the time. I remember being in a business presentation once when I was working AV, where somebody talked about the fact that the first impression you make on somebody is pretty well established in the first 7 seconds, which might not seem like a whole lot as they put it, but try when you're at a stoplight and it turns green, waiting 7 seconds before you step on the accelerator. 6 of those seconds will be spent with people behind you honking at you. All right, I'm going to close things out there. I will post at least one recording of one of these sessions this afternoon if you need to go back and review, or if you were, for tech issues, unable to participate to follow along with this, you can go back over it later if you want to be. And we'll not strictly speaking redo, but we will revisit in various forms a lot of this stuff over the next couple of days. Other than that, save, make sure you're logged out, not just close up all your windows, but log out of your computer. And then you'll be heading down in a second to, as soon as you're done, to room 202, which is pretty much straight down at the other end of the hallway, right around the little corner of the stairwell.
Yes, but.